Welcome to another Compass session. This is a particular Compass session where I want to focus on budgetary pressures and the operational response to them. So that's what the Chief Constable and I will exclusively at this session be concentrating on. So, Chief Constable, budgetary pressures are evident in everybody's mind in the communities, from the press, from every aspect of how we communicate with people and how they communicate with us. So I want to hear your voice answering the questions that the public are keen to understand at a time of particular pressure. I think nearly everyone will agree that there is need for the right funding to meet policing need and to allow you specifically to undertake your responsibilities to deliver operational policing. You and I have written consistently to government since January 2017 concerning the underfunding of Hampshire Constabulary, currently assessed by others as 43 million per year against average funding. And I want to recognise, and I know that I'm alongside you and others in saying that that is the average funding and doesn't recognise or reflect the fact that we're one of the largest constabularies and I serve one of the largest areas in the country.
Absolutely.
And so this reduction in funding, 43 million currently against the average funding, does need to be seen in the context of what proportionately we should get, and it's part of why I campaign, and I know you do too, for fair funding. As it's your responsibility is to deliver operational policing, can you help our communities understand what you need to meet those demands and what you need to meet the coming pressures of the new financial year? So the first question from me, Chief Constable, is can you update me on the changes in pressures that your budget is experiencing this year and expects next year?
Certainly, Commissioner. So your question is about the changes in budget pressures, because of course, whilst we have a budget of about £300 million worth of public money, and we do an awful lot with that, a huge amount of what policing does year on year continues. So that's a requirement around helping people keep safe, that's about stopping crime happening, about dealing with it when it does happen, keeping people safe on our roads and so on. But in terms of the changes, in terms of budget pressures for next year and beyond, a lot of those things that we do grow. So I'll give a couple of examples. One of which across the country, and it's exactly the same here in our constabulary, the calls for emergencies are going up and up and up year on year. Just in July of this year, we had 5,000 more emergency calls than we did in July of last year. That's a huge, huge number. And of course, we must respond to each and every one of those. But also some increases that the public perhaps won't see, but we absolutely do keep on top of to prevent harm happening. As an example, we have over 2,000 registered sex offenders in our area who it's the police's job to monitor. 150 of those are very high risk. We also have 500 prolific offenders, prolific thieves and robbers and so on. And those numbers grow. They grow by about 8% every year. So you can see people join that list rather than drop off it at the other end. So those are huge numbers of people where we keep tabs on them and stop them causing others harm. So that kind of responsibility grows. We've also had some financial pressures that have come in purely as financial pressures. One which people may have seen in the media has been the pension increase, which is not just exclusive to policing, health service, education, similarly. Their increases have been picked up by central government. And actually this isn't real cash, it's a change in the formula, and that's fine, but at the moment that's being left on the toes of police forces, which for us, it could be up to £1 million a year out of that overall budget of 300 that I just spoke about. And we also have a change in our budget pressures about the way we do things like technology. In years gone by, that would be heavily capitalised. Now it's much more about licensing, about things being in the cloud rather than on servers, and therefore those are revenue costs which increase enormously. So to summarise, there's a changing nature of the demand coming to us. There's a burgeoning area of demand which we have anyway, but just grows year on year. And we also have some financial changes which happen to all public sector organisations, but for us make it more difficult as the years go by.
So the changes are growth pressures and the natural rise in costs
Yes.
to deliver many of the same services, but alongside new additions as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. I want to dive deeper in the context of that helpful overview. I just want to dive a little deeper to the root causes. Chief Constable, last year I raised the local precept by the maximum I was allowed by government of £12 per year per Band D property to help meet last year's expected shortfall in the government grant.
Yep.
Can you remind people of the positive difference this £12 addition to local precept made?
It was really welcome, Commissioner, and I know you raised that to the maximum level that you could. In real terms, what that meant is it protected over 100 roles, police officer and staff jobs, who are doing things which keep communities safer. So by you going to that cap of the precept last year, in very real terms, it protected a number of important policing functions.
Right. And if the government hadn't given that very welcome easement, there would have been cuts of that sort of order to stay within budget.
Sadly, yes.
And therefore that £12 made a positive difference for this year, and the increased demands that you described earlier, those are pressures from that base point.
Yes.
Okay. My next point goes on so that was where we are today and how we got here a little bit. Does providing you with the same increase in local precept a further £12, and if government provided flat cash based on, as they did last year, 2017 funding, enable you to meet the pressures you anticipate for the coming year, 2019-20?
So my answer to that question, if we were to have exactly the same money for the next financial year as we have this year, then sadly not. And I know that can be quite difficult to explain. So there are very practical things which are welcome, like all staff getting a 2% pay rise, for instance. I'm really pleased that's come. It's needed for all of my colleagues, but that comes out of that same cash amount. You and I wrote nearly 2 years ago now to the then Police and Fire Minister, and from an operational perspective, I explained that we could make further savings in this current year, which we are doing, but beyond that, I would start to worry about the operational service delivery I could provide. You've also explained that we are underfunded according to the national funding formula. So 2/3 of our money comes from central government grant, 1/3 from council tax. And of that 2/3, the overall policing cake, if you like, the slices are not fairly given out. And everyone agrees that, it's not just me saying so. That's been an accepted position for some time. And we know, sadly, that funding formula won't be looked at for a couple of years or so. So we already start from being behind the curve. So therefore, having exactly the same cash next year as this year will really mean, sadly, a reduction in what we're actually able to do with it for the reasons I've explained.
Chief Constable, we've been talking about the risks and the pressures and choices, difficult choices that we'll need to make in the circumstances of staying within budget. If there were to be an easement of funding given to us by government or an ability for me to raise local precept, what would be the things that would enable?
My wish would be, Commissioner, and I know today we don't know what freedoms there are for all police and crime commissioners in terms of taxation, but I know what this constabulary needs. I know how poorly funded in comparison to others we are, and therefore for me, I know I can make very, very good use of the public money that comes our way in order to stop crime happening, to reassure people, to investigate it when it does happen.
So the test is often, you start with that's an ask.
Yes.
And if the public are being asked to contribute more, they need to be reassured that it'll be wisely spent. And are there any opportunities for us to change what we're doing or to manage that appropriately to focus on what they need within the current budget?
I take very seriously the responsibility that every single public pound should be wisely spent, and I know you hold me to account for that. Independently, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary have assessed us as being one of only 11 police forces around the country that are good across the board, both operationally but also our efficiencies, our financial planning. So everything you would expect a public sector organisation of our scale, we are really good at. And therefore, if we are successful at having further funding into next year, then my promise to you and the communities we both serve is that I will do my utmost for that to be most efficiently spent as possible. And I'm confident in that. We have really good planning mechanisms. We have great data that doesn't just describe what we have done, but what we can anticipate we will have to do. We have really good sets of benchmarking across not just in this country, but elsewhere as well. And we also bring a lot of professional skill into place. So we are always audited on that, and I'm really confident that our planning assumptions are really strong. So whatever the budget, I'm confident that we'll be forward-leaning and we will spend it on the most important things that help keep our communities safe.
Okay, and you made the point about the year we're in, delivering some savings where those were opportunities and some efficiencies where those are opportunities. Can you reassure the public that that will never not feature, even under budget pressures, in looking for those opportunities for the future too?
I will never rest on my laurels. Since I've been a chief officer for 10 years, each of those years has been within a position of austerity. It is the only way I know of doing business. I will be absolutely relentless about driving out those efficiencies. And a lot of that, I'm glad to say, happens nationally. So an awful lot of the technology changes, which are going to have enormous productivity enhancements for policing across the UK, we are delivering here. We're at the forefront of many of them. So absolutely, we will never rest on our laurels in that sense.
And you share with me on a routine basis, and with our teams amongst themselves, share the growing evidence base and the authoritative data that we're collecting. Is that a journey that will continue to improve, or are we yet at some level for that? I've noticed the improvement since I've been here in the work that you've encouraged in your teams to look for ever better data to support predicting what the future will look like. Is that a continuing journey? It
is continuing, and of course it's not just police data, so the more across the public service we can share data, safely of course, then the more we're able to get upstream of problems and stop them happening in the first place.
Okay, good. I want to now move on to a community focus. I hear too often, for any comfort, their perception that local neighbourhood policing is being eroded. I regularly hear the lack of visible policing. There's clearly a contradiction here with some of the briefings where you brief me regularly of your determination to protect and the quality that you see in your constabulary of achieving that where others may not have matched us for sustaining local policing, and matching my determination that local policing will always be a key priority, and my direction to you, that's the community's view too. So can you tell our communities who express these concerns how their view of a reducing local policing presence is not the case?
So it is true that we are a smaller workforce than we were a few years ago. It's also true that the nature of our work has changed enormously in recent years, and I anticipate the pace of that change continuing. But one example, we have as many serious sexual offences reported to us as we do house burglaries. It's about 2,500 each of those a year. We've always taken house burglary very seriously. We've always wanted to stop that happening, and if it happens, we investigate it well. Similarly, though, now with sexual offences on that same level. So to give you a sense of how things are changing. But also, an awful lot of what we do is not necessarily in the public eye. So the reason a bobby's hat is as tall as it is so that police officers could be seen. We know now, as a volume crime, sadly, people are scammed online. Just one example, retail banks. We have a fantastic relationship with retail banks, and £1.6 million of normal people's savings hasn't been handed over because of the vigilance of people in retail banks, as an example. So similarly, scamming online and people being defrauded online. We do a huge amount to prevent that happening. We do a huge amount to investigate it. But of course, that's all out of the public eye. That is very much local policing, because it's local people being harmed, local people learning how to keep themselves safe. But we also have done some significant changes. So responding in an emergency. Our response officers and staff are now placed on a shift pattern and in locations that is the best in the country in terms of getting to where people need us, on the times of days we know they need us, and get there quickly. It is second to none in that regard. But we also have the practicalities of things external to us. So in the last few months, Salisbury, London, royal weddings. There are lots of events where those same local officers go and work elsewhere. It's not a separate lot of police officers and staff that I have to do those kind of responsibilities. So we are a smaller workforce. We are doing an awful lot now, though, out of the public eye, but which is still very much about keeping very local people safe. We also have a fantastic range of volunteers who work with us. 16% of my workforce are volunteers. They are fantastic, whether they're special constables or cyber specials, whether they're cadets. There's such a range of volunteers, and we couldn't do what we do without them.
I think the message that I've been hearing since I've been in this post is that the perceptions of some of our communities, some members of the public, have fallen behind what operationally effective policing does for them.
Yep.
And there are memories of different days, actually some of them false memories I suspect, or not fully informed memories. Is there something for you and your colleagues in the constabulary to do to land the effectiveness and the difference and the change for what policing today looks like and going forward, so that that community sense of regret of some loss as they perceive it of visible policing is balanced by understanding what you're doing? And this will help. I hope people will watch the campus meetings, but is there something to dial up in that, and is that in progress? Or
It's always in progress. I understand that the sense of reassurance that seeing someone in a police uniform brings. It's a very real sense, and I understand that. But we're also accessible in lots of different ways. But our effectiveness changes. So a really simple example, we now keep young people safe online because the risk to them is posed online, often on their own laptops in their own homes, than we do patrolling parks. Fact. We are out looking for people who are missing using drones as much as we do, people in long lines, looking for someone who's gone missing.
Is the question, you know that, and your colleagues are doing that,
but are
the public hearing that to reassure them?
I want to have as many opportunities to have that debate publicly as I can. This is an enormously helpful way of doing it through this campus process. But no, there is more to do on that front.
I think that jointly we can do more as well. That's, I want to be on the journey to support that. I also hear concerns, specific concerns. So I've been talking about the sense of visible policing. PCSOs at the moment are a group of valued contributors to local safety, local reassurance, local intelligence, local engagement, and just valuable people in the communities. There is a concern that these local policing assets are no longer to feature in policing plans nationally, and that reads across into a sense of concern whether they'll feature in your plans for the future, removing a valuable connection to those living within these communities. So can you reassure people that whatever might be under review, that local policing in neighbourhoods will be protected and that the day-to-day engagement will be sustained even in a different deployment pattern?
So local policing is everything from responding in an emergency to investigating. Regional organised crime colleagues work in locality. Neighbourhood policing, in my mind, very much is local beat officers, beat bobbies as used to be called, police community support officers. So that really close relationship, enduring relationship with one's neighbourhood in a city, village, town, and so on. And so they are a part of a local policing response. PCSOs have been with us for a generation. In my view, and I've said this before at Compass, they are fantastic in remaining close to neighbourhood, close to the problems, and having that enduring relationship with the public, which is really at the heart of the British policing model, actually. But I am having a look at the skills that I need to deal with the problems and demand that I see coming over the horizon. So I've talked about the change in sexual offences. A huge amount of work that we do is domestic abuse. So an awful lot of what happens behind closed doors. So already police community support officers focus on those who are vulnerable, focus on those who wish to cause others harm. That's their job. Compared with almost every other force commissioner, we have a huge number of PCSOs, and in recent years we've been really fortunate and have worked hard to protect them. Without knowing what the future budget is, what I can't today say is that those numbers of PCSOs will be protected or the numbers of police officers will be. I want them to be very, very richly resourced in all of our neighbourhoods. But I am having a look at the different model and the different ratio between officers and PCSOs because I need a different skill set. I need people who can investigate within neighbourhoods. But as I say, compared with other forces, we are still doing very well. I think the opportunity that presents ourselves here is to try and do our utmost to retain that really great and rich and knowledgeable neighbourhood policing presence as much as we possibly can.
Okay. And I think the greatest concern is about sustaining something that will be local. The pressures that people see that draw to the higher end and the most immediate greatest threats, risks of harm. I think people, when you form your plan and then we let the public know what it is, there are two bits I draw out of what you've just said. First is, if there's enough funding, you can do something valuable with that money to keep people safer. And the second thing is that you will have in your mind, not least because I'll reinforce it for you at every point, the need to sustain and reassure people of what the local content of policing will be, so that people understand and feel they are supported locally.
There's no question of that. I mean, we've been in austerity for 10 years. In this constabulary, we have kept our PCSO numbers very, very high. As I've said, we've kept our dedicated neighbourhood officers very, very high. We've looked at all the back office work, we've done all of the enabling work, we've looked at an awful lot of our specialist resource, whilst keeping, as untouched as we possibly can, the very, very neighbourhood officers. What I can't promise, without budget to support it, of course, is that will be the position that goes into the future. If that's the case, it will be with a very, very heavy heart, but it will also be a position that I'll be confident is the best that we can afford. Our focus is on keeping people safe and those who really need us.
Okay, I think that's clear, so thank you. I want to move on to something that's very much in the public eye at the moment, whether it's with your voice as a Chief Constable surrounded by lots of your colleagues or the Chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, talking about the focus of policing on core policing, on, as I sometimes have asked you before, on doing just those, are we certain that policing is doing all those things that only policing can do, as well as the appropriate reach out to partners. So can you explain how you're balancing the pressures to meet local needs and policing specific things with how you prioritise those competing needs and opportunities that you see for keeping us safer?
You're right, Commissioner. This is there's quite a large public debate going on around this, which I really welcome, actually. It's true that there are lots of things that happen in society and in our communities which the police may not be the first or the best agency to deal with. That isn't us handing over responsibility to elsewhere, but actually we can do an awful lot of things, but we can't do everything. And it is part of my job as the operational leader to make that clear. But there are a number of things which statutorily the police have to do. So of course we have to answer 999 calls. Hundreds of thousands of those every year, and we do that. And we get to people in time, and we get to people according to why they need us, and we're able to support them when we get there. So that's the 999 calls. But we also have specialist emergency response, be that firearms officers, and you'll know in recent years we've increased those. We also have people who can respond with great skill when sadly people are killed on our roads. So there's all sorts of specialist emergency response that we also have to give statutorily. When tragedy strikes and we have a murder or other very serious crime, the police have a job and a duty to investigate. And of course, most recently, we've seen the awful murder of Lucy McHugh in Southampton. The whole constabulary turned towards investigating Lucy's death, and I'm really pleased that charges have now been brought. That was a huge effort by every single department and team of this police force when something that awful happens. We also, every day, through our neighbourhood teams, are monitoring, as I've said, 2,000 registered sex offenders. There's an awful lot of statutory duties that fall to the police to stop local people like our families, falling foul of others who would do them harm. So every day we have enormous statutory duties in that front. So there's quite a long list, actually, of what the police must do. And it's beyond that, then, where the choices are made. And the most recent discussions have been very welcome about we can cut our cloth, we are forward-leaning, we spend our money very, very well, but we can't do everything. And it's beyond that where the choices are made.
For me, I think that's the focus is if the pressure financially and from demand, in whichever order you say those, if operational effectiveness requires the resources to do what policing and any policing can do, what is the impact on reaching out into those things that are preventative, and how many of those are impacted? Are you finding that the demand on you is rising because others are in their version of difficult financial and demand circumstances? And
that's true. So it isn't one agency that has a direct impact on policing. It's often a tiny piece of a jigsaw, one by one, that add up to quite a material shift. So there are some really good things that the police no longer do because others do it better. So one of the things that you commission are domestic abuse services, which are much better dealt with in the medium term by specialists than they are by policing. And that's a really good example of something going to a better place than staying in policing. It is true, though, that, and again, this is across the country as well as in Hampshire, that at 4 o'clock on a Monday to Friday, the calls into us from other agencies peak. So that is when other agencies' offices are closing. There's an ongoing risk or worry for a particular case or a particular household, and that risk looks to be given to the police. Now, we're not going to say no. What we are, though, doing is having some really tough conversations with partners about how can we stop this happening, because that's probably not the best service for those who need it, because we are not the experts in all things. So we are working through on a case-by-case with partner agencies in that place. But the other thing, there are genuinely more people with mental health problems now, both being victims of harm, but also causing themselves and others harm than there were a few years ago. Everyone would accept that's the position. And there's real complexity that comes with that. And the health service work really well with us on that front, but they are also stretched financially. So we are together. We are lucky that we have excellent relationships with statutory partners here, with not-for-profit partners, with commission services, and we are all pointing in the same direction to try and get upstream. We would all rather stop people falling in the river than fish them out afterwards. We are all trying to do that together, and there's also been some fantastic opportunity through some funding you've secured, albeit on a 1-year, 18-month basis, but it's very welcome to help us as wider statutory agencies get upstream, particularly around things like domestic abuse, things like serious violence, to work together to stop harm happening in the first place.
Good. For me, the test of local policing, where the communities prioritise that almost above anything else, they want a sense of the local response, local policing, and you've answered questions about that. Alongside those, the connections we have with our partners that you were just talking about, will your operational stance sustain the preventing rather than just responding to threats that are realised and investigating them and bringing them to account? Will those pressures still give you the resource for that, where occasionally our partners can do something that reduces demand on policing, as you've described, will you still have the resource to contribute policing expertise into those partnerships to enable them to be more effective? Is that under pressure?
That is under pressure, and that's where the opportunity lies. So we will always respond to emergency calls. We will always investigate serious and complex crime when they've happened. Beyond that is where the choices lie. Professionally, I've been at this all my career. I want us to be excellent at preventing crime. We do lots of fantastic stuff already, be that in the nighttime licensing in our cities, through to monitoring sex offenders, through to working with young people at the risk of getting into a life of crime. There's lots that we already do, but I can see where we could do so much more, and I do worry about the uplift in serious violence. I do worry about the changing nature of crime. So I want us to do more of that, and that's where the opportunity lies. Without significant different funding and more funding, yes, my ability to devote resources to preventative work is limited.
Okay, thank you. I think that's what I hope we've covered for the communities that we're talking to, is a sense of the pressures and demands, a sense of the values and the approaches that you're taking, and that you've outlined some of the risks where you can't do everything with the resource you've currently got. So thank you very much for answering those questions and recognising the need to continue to land with the public an understanding of what operational policing can do today and for the future, because I think it is a journey that is a tension for them, alongside tensions with other partners. So I think it's a difficult time to be progressing and actually being really clear what the delivery, the values, the choices that you're making to the public, and for those messages to land and spread when they get it in their voice is a necessary resource at a time of difficulty.
I think that's true, Commissioner. What I would add to that is that it is a fact that universal services in all aspects of life are different now than they were a few years ago. But all of the preventative work that we do, and I would dearly like us to do much more, it is stopping people in villages, in towns, in neighbourhoods and streets becoming victims or suffering harm. So they'll never see or feel that, because we've got ahead of it to stop it happening in the first place. And that's quite a difficult argument to win, but professionally I know that's the case.
Chief Constable, the public often hear a phrase that talks about the increasing complexity of crime, whether they hear that from government, they hear that from professional policing, they hear that from members of the community in specialist areas. Is that starkly the case, and how do you manage that aspect in terms of understanding growing demand or managing that demand?
It is absolutely the case, Commissioner, and I'll give you an example. So whilst we have over 160,000 crimes reported to Hampshire Constabulary every year, the nature and the ratios within that figure have changed massively and will continue to do so. And they're not one-on-one in terms of how difficult they are to investigate. So for instance, if someone has their purse stolen from a nightclub, regrettable though that is, there are certain lines of inquiries one can take. You can't compare that though to an investigation of a historic sex offence or a rape or a complex fraud where perhaps the offenders are abroad. They are much, much more difficult to investigate. There's often huge amounts of digital data, and we've heard in the news about how important that is to disclose and to work through, vast quantities of that. So the time taken and the expertise to investigate that changing complexity of crime is a world away from where it was even a few years ago. And whilst we have capability, we have enormous skill, clearly that skill, together with the time it takes, costs money, and there are tough decisions to be made about where to put that money and that resource.